A police canine's instinct uncovered a mother's secret and saved a life. The airport was nearly silent. Just the low hum of fluorescent lights, the muted roll of suitcase wheels, and the distant echo of overhead announcements. Officer Nora Vance adjusted her vest as she walked beside Koda, her canine partner. It had been an uneventful shift until he froze. Koda's ears perked, his body stiffened. Then he lunged. A scream erupted. A woman with a stroller staggered backward as the German shepherd barked, teeth bared, eyes locked on the baby. Chaos. People shouted. Security closed in. Nora's heart raced as she reached Koda only to see what had fallen beneath the blue baby blanket. A loaded Glock 19. And beside it, the baby, still breathing. No one could explain it. But Koda had known, and what unraveled next would expose not only a weapon, but a war a mother had been fighting in silence. The graveyard shift at Seattle-Tacoma International had a rhythm of its own. It didn't roar like the day. It hummed, a low, steady murmur of tired footsteps, distant rolling luggage, and the occasional scratch of static from a security radio. Under the sterile overhead lights, the world moved in slow motion, as if even time itself was reluctant to stay awake. Nora Vance moved through that quiet with silent precision, boots soft against polished floors, her badge clipped tight to a navy blue uniform that bore the invisible weight of too many years in uniformed service. Beside her, padding without a sound, was Koda, her canine partner, her shadow, and in ways she never spoke of out loud, her anchor. The German shepherd was lean, darker than most, with a thick sable coat that gleamed under the halogens. His ears were perpetually alert, tail still, eyes alive with an intelligence that made some officers uneasy. But Nora? She trusted him more than she trusted most people. He didn't just react, he read. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Their partnership had been forged not just in hours of training drills or drug detection sweeps, but in the liminal space between instinct and understanding. Where others saw a dog, Nora saw discernment. Where others saw a silent handler, Koda saw pain. It had been 7 months since they were paired. 7 months since Nora had transferred from military duty overseas into customs enforcement stateside. She still hadn't figured out if the scars on her leg hurt more than the ones buried deeper. But Koda never flinched at either. Tonight was supposed to be routine. It usually was. The international arrivals gate had just processed a flight from Tokyo, another from Incheon. Families reunited, solo travelers clutched backpacks and blinking phones. The air smelled faintly of cleaning solution, burnt coffee, and the long-haul flights of strangers. Koda sniffed the air, calm. Nora adjusted her utility belt and glanced at the large analog clock above the Delta gate, 12:06 a.m., halfway through. They moved past a food kiosk with chairs stacked on tabletops, past a janitor mopping with earbuds in. Koda slowed near a vending machine, then quickened again without a sound. Nora kept her stride in sync. At one point, an officer passing by nodded at her and offered a half grin. "You two ever sleep?" "Only when we're off duty," Nora replied, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The man laughed, kept walking. Koda didn't even turn his head. She'd never been the type to speak unnecessarily. In Afghanistan, that kind of restraint had meant survival. Here it was just who she was now, a woman rebuilt around silence. But silence wasn't absence. It was focus. And tonight, something was off. It wasn't visible, not yet, but Nora felt the change in Koda before she saw it. He stiffened just slightly, like a coiled spring holding its breath. His ears pricked forward. The air around them shifted, subtle but unmistakable. "Koda," she murmured under her breath. His posture didn't relax. Instead, he turned his head just a few degrees and stared. At first, Nora didn't see what he was focused on, but then, from the far end of the concourse, a woman entered their line of sight, pushing a dark navy blue stroller, wearing an oversized gray cardigan. Her hair was in a hurried bun, her movements efficient yet oddly rigid. Nora's instincts kicked in. Not panic, just heightened awareness. The woman was alone, mid-30s, Korean descent, she guessed. Her clothes were wrinkled, face pale, and something else. Her eyes. Even from a distance, Nora could see it, the way the woman avoided scanning the space around her. No eye contact, no curiosity. Only a mechanical forward motion, as if walking was an obligation rather than a choice. And then Nora saw it. A drop of sweat rolling down the woman's temple. The terminal was cool. Too cool for that. Koda's growl was almost imperceptible. Nora reached for his leash, felt it tauten slightly in her hand. But Koda didn't wait. He surged forward, silent no longer, a bark ripping through the dead air like a siren. "Whoa, Koda! Heel!" Nora shouted, instincts flaring as she moved with him. Passengers turned, startled. A child screamed. The janitor dropped his mop. The woman froze mid-step, her eyes went wide. "No, please!" But Koda was already there. He didn't attack, he didn't bite. He launched forward with measured force, landing on his hind legs, placing both front paws on the side of the stroller. His snout dove downward, teeth bared, barking like the world depended on it. And maybe, Nora would think later, it did. The blanket fell away. Blue fleece, delicate and warm, slipped from the stroller and drifted like a petal to the floor. What it revealed beneath made time stop. A baby, perhaps 8 months old, blinked up at the ceiling, startled but unharmed, and under the baby's small legs, wedged tightly to the metal frame of the stroller with industrial tape, was a black matte pistol. Nora moved in before anyone could breathe. "Clear the area," she shouted. "Get security, now, armed threat." Another officer radioed in. Screams rose and then collapsed into stunned silence. Koda remained locked in place, snarling at the stroller like it might move again. Nora saw the gun clearly now. A Glock 19, hammer drawn, safety off, loaded. The woman, Isabelle, stood frozen in place. Her hands trembled at her sides, lips parted in mute horror. She looked not like a perpetrator, but like someone watching a nightmare unfold in front of her own child. "Ma'am, hands up right now," Nora ordered. Isabelle obeyed, her voice cracking into the air like dried paper. "Please, please don't hurt him." But Nora wasn't looking at Isabelle anymore. She looked down into Koda's eyes. And Koda was calm now. No longer barking, no longer growling, his head tilted, watching the baby, not the weapon. The baby had never been the danger. And somehow Nora knew. Koda had known all along. The airport terminal always felt like it was in a state of waiting. Polished floors gleaming too bright, security glass humming faintly, bodies moving through checkpoints like chess pieces across a board. But that night, under the sterile fluorescence of Gate C-17, something cracked in the pattern. Koda stopped walking. Just one step behind her, leash slack in her hand, Nora felt it immediately, the absence of movement. She turned her head just enough to catch his profile. His body had gone still in that way trained dogs only do when their instincts override everything else. His ears twitched forward. His nose flared once, then again. Low in his throat, a hum began, not quite a growl, not quite silence. "What is it, boy?" she asked quietly, shifting her gaze to follow his line of sight. And then she saw her. The woman wasn't particularly remarkable at first glance. No rushing, no obvious signs of trouble. She wore a long, oatmeal-colored coat, cinched at the waist. Her hair was neat but hastily tied. One hand pushed a navy blue stroller with a rhythmic, almost mechanical motion. But it was her eyes that didn't match. They didn't search. They didn't scan. They avoided. Even from a distance, Nora saw it. The downward angle of her gaze, the way she refused to meet the world. Her face was expressionless, but her body was clenched. The hand gripping the stroller handle was so tight her knuckles had gone pale. And then there it was. A single bead of sweat trailing down the woman's temple. Just one. But it was enough. The terminal was freezing. Industrial air conditioning hissed from every vent. No one else was sweating. Koda's posture changed in an instant. His tail stiffened, his shoulders squared. The quiet hum turned to a low, warning growl. "Koda, heel," Nora commanded, firm but controlled. He didn't move. Instead, he took one step forward. Nora blinked, heart tightening. She tightened her grip on the leash, instincts suddenly alert. She opened her mouth again, but before she could issue a second command, Koda bolted. The leash ripped from her hand. Time didn't just slow. It fractured. Passengers turned. A woman shrieked. Somewhere in the distance, a janitor's mop clattered to the floor. Koda sprinted across the polished marble with laser focus, not barking at first, just moving. Target locked. The stroller, the woman, Isabelle Ree. She spun instinctively toward the noise, saw the blur of tan and black fur barreling toward her, and screamed, "No, please, don't!" She tried to shield the stroller with her body, arms flailing in panic. Her purse toppled, contents scattering. The stroller jolted sideways. Then the bark came. It wasn't random. It wasn't a mindless dog losing control. It was a warning, a scream, a siren in fur. Nora sprinted after him, heart pounding, voice sharp through the air. "Koda, stand down, heel!" But Koda was already on his hind legs, paws braced on the frame of the stroller. He didn't lunge, he didn't bite. He held, his head dipped toward the child, barking, snapping at something just under the blue fleece blanket. The terminal erupted. Gasps, screams. People ran. Someone shouted for security. Another pulled out their phone. But all Nora saw was the woman, frozen, arms out, tears brimming in her eyes. And then the blanket slipped. One soft corner gave way, fluttered down, and revealed not just the infant, eyes wide, lower lip trembling, but something black and matte wedged beneath his legs. Metal. A Glock 19. Loaded. The breath punched out of Nora's lungs. She dropped to one knee, hand on her holster, eyes scanning for threats. Koda growled again, but softer this time, protective, not violent. Nora's voice rang out like a shot. "Security to gate C-17! We have a live firearm! Area lockdown, now!" 2 TSA agents bolted toward them. One moved to block civilians. The other drew a weapon, barking instructions. The woman, Isabelle, collapsed to her knees beside the stroller, arms shaking. Her voice, when it finally broke free, was barely audible over the chaos. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I swear. Please." But Nora's attention was fixed on Koda. The German shepherd had gone still again, his snout inches from the baby's chest. The barking had stopped. He tilted his head slightly, nose twitching once. And in that moment, Nora understood. He hadn't been attacking. He'd been warning. not about the baby, but about the truth buried under that blanket. It should have been a scream that echoed loudest in the terminal, but it wasn't. It was the silence after, the kind that wraps around panic like a vice. That moment between realization and reaction, when the world forgets how to breathe. The blue baby blanket drifted to the floor in slow motion, as if refusing to bear witness to what it had concealed. Beneath it, cushioned by the stroller's lining and fastened with thick black tape, was the unmistakable glint of steel. A Glock 19, loaded, safety off. Its barrel angled upward, tucked beneath the small, diapered body of a baby who now whimpered softly, eyes fluttering against the sudden light. For one awful second, no one moved. Then the room fractured. "Gun!" someone yelled. "Get down!" shouted a security officer, drawing his sidearm. Passengers screamed. Luggage toppled. A woman slipped near the food kiosk, dropping a suitcase that burst open with clothes. Others hit the ground or scrambled behind kiosks, forming a human wave of confusion and terror. And through it all, Koda stayed exactly where he was. Front paws planted firmly on the frame of the stroller, head low, gaze trained not on the baby, but on the weapon. He didn't bark again. He didn't growl. He was guarding now, not attacking. Nora reached him in seconds. Her knees hit the tile with a force she barely registered. Her voice was steady but clipped, aimed at the officers around her. "Lock the terminal. Shut down all exits. Isolate this area, now." Two TSA agents moved into position, radioing for backup. One gently but firmly pulled passengers behind a rolling partition. Nora leaned in slowly, fingers grazing the corner of the weapon. It was taped intentionally. Precision placement. Whoever had done it wanted the gun to stay hidden but still be accessible. Duct tape wrapped around the stroller's crossbar, just beneath the infant's legs, tight enough to hold, but loose enough to pull free in seconds if needed. Her gut twisted. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't clumsy. This was designed. She carefully withdrew the Glock, thumb brushing the grip. Warm. Not hot, but not cold either, like it had been handled recently. Beside her, the baby let out a high, quivering cry. It was that cry, not the weapon, not the chaos, that made Nora's heart twist hardest. "Shh," she whispered automatically, tucking the weapon safely into her holster. "You're okay. You're safe now." Behind her, Isabelle collapsed to her knees. Not in resistance, not even in defense, but like her body simply gave up. As if the air had been pulled from her lungs and she no longer remembered what standing was. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes weren't locked on the gun. They were locked on her child. Nora turned toward her, still crouched low. "Is this your baby?" she asked, tone low, even. Isabelle nodded, barely. "His name is Benjamin." More agents arrived, weapons drawn, shouting over each other, assessing threats. But Nora raised a hand. "Stand down. The weapon is secure. No further threats visible." A beat of stillness fell again, the kind that only comes after something almost unthinkable. She looked down at Koda. He had stepped back now, just a few inches. His breathing was steady. His eyes flicked to the baby, then to Isabelle, then back to Nora. And in that look, she understood. He had smelled it, felt it. Not just the gun, not just the oil and metal, but something else. Fear, desperation, danger, not of the shooter's kind, but the running kind, the cornered kind. Koda hadn't attacked. He had alerted to something no one else could see. "Secure her," Nora said quietly. "But don't use force. She's not resisting." One of the agents moved in with handcuffs, but Nora waved him back and stepped closer to Isabelle herself. "I need you to come with me," she said gently. Isabelle's eyes were wide, trembling. Her whole body shook. But still, she whispered, "I didn't hurt him. I just wanted to—" She never finished. Her voice broke. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the sweat already clinging to her skin. She didn't wipe them away. Nora glanced again at Koda. He had circled around and now stood between the stroller and the gathering officers, not blocking but buffering. He was placing himself between threat and child, as he always did. Nora knelt down, just for a second, and placed her hand softly on his shoulder. "You knew," she whispered. "You saw it before any of us did." Koda didn't move. He didn't have to. Behind them, the chaos of the terminal was fading into controlled procedure, officers barking orders, passengers being directed away, footage being pulled. But in that one small circle of floor, time remained suspended. A baby, a woman, a weapon, and a dog that didn't bark to kill, only to protect. The walls didn't echo. They absorbed. That was the thing about interrogation rooms. Built not for comfort or clarity, but containment. No pictures, no windows. Just dull gray cinder block, a metal table bolted to the floor, and two chairs facing each other like opposing sides in a war no one had agreed to fight. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting pale shadows over the woman seated at the center of it all. Isabelle Rhee sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, wrists still bare. She hadn't been cuffed. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't said a word since they brought her in. Her coat had been removed. She sat now in a plain ivory blouse, the collar slightly rumpled, one button missing at the sleeve. Her posture was still, too still, like a sculpture carved from fatigue. Not guilt, not defiance, just empty. On the other side of the one-way mirror, Nora stood with her arms crossed, saying nothing. A senior customs officer to her left cleared his throat. "We've verified her passport. It's real. She entered legally. But the baby's ID—" "Forged?" Nora asked. He nodded. "Most likely. Age mismatch. The baby's 5 months, not 7, like the document says. No prior arrests, no flags on her name. Her Korean visa's expired, but that gun—" He exhaled through his nose. "It's registered in the U.S., reported stolen last year from a gun shop in Tacoma. How it ended up taped under a baby." He didn't finish the sentence, because there was no neat way to end that thought. Nora didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the woman behind the glass, the woman who hadn't cried when they read her rights, hadn't asked for a lawyer, hadn't pleaded or shouted. She just sat there, paler than when they'd first seen her, smaller somehow, under the sterile light. Nora looked down at the pad in her hand. The baby, Benjamin, had been checked by airport medics and was now asleep in a quiet office, curled in the arms of a female CBP agent who'd once worked pediatric trauma. He was dehydrated but uninjured, cared for, if not recently nurtured. But Isabelle, she looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, or weeks, maybe longer. There were smudges beneath her eyes that couldn't have come from makeup. Her lips were cracked. There was a tear in the side seam of her blouse, hand-stitched, rushed. People who plan calculated acts of violence don't hand-stitch their own shirts. "Want me to go in?" the senior officer asked. Nora shook her head. Not yet. She stepped closer to the glass. Not to intimidate. Just to see. There was something in Isabelle's shoulders, in the way they were drawn in, not defensive, but protective. It was the same way a mother might hunch over a child in a thunderstorm. Even now, even without her baby in the room, she hadn't let go of that posture. Her fingers twitched slightly. She pressed her hands together again. She looked like she was holding herself together by willpower alone, and still, no resistance, no words, no outrage, just that terrible quiet stillness. Nora exhaled and turned toward the door. I'll go. The officer looked surprised. You sure? She's not going to respond to badges and threat tones. Nora's voice was calm but firm. Whatever this is, she's not some cartel mule. She's running from something. He didn't argue, just nodded and stepped back. Nora pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The change in temperature was immediate. The room was kept deliberately cold, some bureaucratic theory about discomfort disarming deception. But tonight, it just felt like punishment for someone already frayed. Isabelle didn't flinch when Nora entered, didn't look up, just sat there, eyes unfocused. Nora pulled the chair back softly and took a seat across from her. She placed her folder down, but didn't open it. Silence. A long one. Isabelle blinked slowly, as if the effort to even acknowledge the space around her took more energy than she had left. Nora studied her face, not for signs of guilt, but for signs of someone drowning beneath the surface. You haven't asked where your son is, Nora said quietly. That landed. Isabelle's eyes flickered. Her throat bobbed with a swallow, dry and shallow. He's safe, Nora added gently. With an agent who's trained to care for infants in emergency situations. He's warm. He's sleeping. A tear slipped down Isabelle's cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. I didn't want to hurt anyone, she whispered, voice hoarse. I believe you, Nora said. And she did, because there was something in this room colder than the air. It was fear, but not the kind that lashes out. The kind that hides a loaded weapon under a stroller not because it wants to be used, but because the world has made you believe you'll need it. The hallway outside the interrogation room was quiet, but not empty. Not with Koda there. The German shepherd sat perfectly still, his body squared and symmetrical, like a monument carved out of loyalty. His gaze didn't wander. His ears didn't twitch. His tail rested flat on the linoleum. He was waiting, not for a treat, not for praise, but for something harder to define, something he'd felt long before anyone else had known there was something to feel. Across the glass, just a few feet of wall and reinforced soundproofing away, Isabelle was being questioned. But Koda wasn't watching the room. He was watching the door. And Nora noticed. She stood a few steps away, arms folded, coffee cooling in her grip, her back resting against the wall as if her bones needed help holding her up. Her uniform jacket was unzipped, collar loosened, her expression unreadable, the kind of neutral face that soldiers learn to wear when every emotion inside is louder than logic allows. She looked down at Koda again. He hasn't moved in 20 minutes, the officer beside her muttered, half trying to sound amused. He won't, Nora said softly. The officer raised a brow. You think he's guarding her? No, Nora answered. Her voice wasn't dismissive, it was distant, reflective. He's listening. She took a slow breath and crouched beside him, balancing her forearms on her knees. Her hand hovered near his shoulder, but she didn't touch him. Not yet. You saw her before I did, huh? She murmured. Koda didn't respond, just stared ahead, alert, but not tense, focused. And suddenly, Nora was elsewhere. She was back in that gravel-floored training yard outside of Fort Lewis. The first week she'd been assigned to Koda. The sun had been unforgiving, and her leg had still throbbed from an old IED injury that the doctor said should have healed by now. He hadn't obeyed a single command that day. He'd stood his ground, met her eyes, and simply refused. Not aggressively, not fearfully, just refused. The lead trainer had muttered something under his breath. Too stubborn. He won't conform. 4 failed pairings. You sure you want to try? But Nora hadn't said anything. She had just knelt down, like now, and looked Koda in the eye. And he had looked back, not like an animal, not like a trainee, but like something that had learned the hard way to only trust those who earned it. And now here he was again, 6 months and 100 shifts later, still refusing to conform, still waiting for a truth the rest of them hadn't figured out yet. Nora's hand dropped to his fur, resting lightly. His ear twitched once beneath her fingers, but his gaze didn't shift. I don't think she's a threat, Nora said aloud, though not really to anyone. The hallway was dim, cast in that dull government glow that made everything look a little sick. Somewhere down the corridor, a printer sputtered and stopped. A door closed. Silence folded back in. I think she's scared, Nora added. Still, Koda didn't move, but in the quiet she swore he exhaled. Slow, low, a breath not of exhaustion, but of agreement. Because Koda had always known what most people didn't. Fear and danger aren't always the same thing. Sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is calm, smiling, clean-shaven, and confident. And sometimes, the person holding the weapon is just trying not to disappear. Nora leaned her back against the wall again, her eyes flicking toward the closed interrogation door. I should have seen it earlier, she whispered. Koda finally blinked. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable. But to Nora, it said everything. He wasn't angry. He wasn't impatient. He just knew. The room hadn't changed, but something in the air had. Nora stepped back into the interrogation chamber slowly, letting the heavy door shut behind her with a soft thud that felt louder than it was. Isabelle hadn't moved. She still sat in the same stiff chair, shoulders curled slightly inward, hands clasped in her lap like they were holding something invisible together. She didn't look up when Nora entered. She didn't speak. Only the subtle twitch of her fingers betrayed the awareness that someone had returned. Nora stood for a moment without saying anything. There was a silence to the room that wasn't empty. It was dense, like grief, like pressure, like something waiting to crack. She pulled out the chair across from Isabelle and sat. The table between them was metal, cold and impersonal. The file folder she carried stayed shut. I know you're tired, Nora said gently. No response. I know you probably don't trust me. Not yet. Still nothing, but her eyes flicked upward, brief, like a reflex. Your son is still asleep, Nora added. He's safe. At that, Isabelle's lip trembled. She turned her face slightly away, as if she didn't want that information to hit her full in the chest. But it had. Nora studied her carefully, not like an interrogator, but like a medic examining a wound she couldn't quite see. You didn't fight, she said softly. You didn't run, even when the gun was found. No answer. I've seen people with nothing to hide fall apart under pressure, And I've seen liars pretend to be saints. You're not doing either." That made Isabelle blink. Twice. Her throat bobbed like she was trying to swallow something that wouldn't go down. Nora didn't push further. She reached into her jacket and tapped her radio once. "Send him in." The door behind her opened with a gentle click, and in walked Koda. No leash, no command, just calm, deliberate steps across the room, pad soft against the floor, tail low but relaxed, his entire body a study in measured grace. Isabelle's eyes widened, and for the first time since she'd been detained, she spoke. Just one word. "Why?" Nora didn't answer. She didn't need to. Koda approached slowly, not as a threat, not as a tool of law enforcement, but as something older, quieter, as presence, as understanding. He stopped beside Isabelle's chair, didn't sniff, didn't bark, just stood there for a beat. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head and rested his muzzle on her knee, a touch that was not surveillance, not suspicion, just connection. That's when it happened. Isabelle broke, not loudly, not violently. Her shoulders didn't shake. Her breath didn't hitch in gasps. It was quieter than that, more devastating in its restraint. Her chest rose once, sharply. Her eyes filled, but no sob escaped. She reached out with a trembling hand, hesitant, then surer, and laid it gently on Koda's head. Her fingers curled into his fur like she'd been underwater too long and finally reached air. "I didn't know if anyone would believe me," she whispered, voice so thin it barely held weight. "But he did." She looked up at Nora, not defiant, not pleading, just seen. "He knew I wasn't dangerous," she said, more to Koda than anyone else. "He knew I was just scared." Nora's voice was quiet when she replied, "He knew because he's been there too." That earned a flicker of confusion. Isabelle's brows drew in just slightly. "He wasn't always the calm one," Nora said, one corner of her mouth lifting in something not quite a smile. "They almost pulled him from the program, said he was disobedient, too reactive, too intense." She reached across the table just slightly, not a threat, just presence. But what they called disobedient was really just instinct. Koda hadn't moved. His eyes were half closed now, still resting against Isabelle's leg like he knew the weight she was carrying, and had decided to shoulder some of it for her. "Whatever this is," Nora said, her voice barely above a murmur, "you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Isabelle didn't respond right away, but when she finally spoke, the words came from somewhere buried deep. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." Nora nodded. "I know. I just didn't know where else to go." The silence after that wasn't empty. It was honest. And it was the beginning. The hum of the overhead lights returned like a whisper too long ignored. The room had settled, but not into comfort, into weight. Nora didn't speak. She simply waited. Across the table, Isabelle sat with one hand resting on Koda's fur, the other trembling near her chest. Her breath was uneven, not panicked anymore, but measured, as if she was building the courage to let go of something she'd clung to for too long. Nora leaned forward slightly, eyes soft. "Whatever it is, you're safe now." That word, safe, seemed foreign in the air, like a note from a language Isabelle had forgotten how to speak. Her fingers moved slowly, rising to the delicate gold chain around her neck. It was subtle, a crucifix, modest in size, dulled with wear. Nothing extraordinary to the untrained eye, but Isabelle's grip on it was firm, not ornamental but instinctual, like it had been her anchor in every storm that had tried to take her under. She didn't unclasp it. She simply pulled, hard enough for the chain to break with a soft snap. Then, with a final breath, she laid it on the cold metal table between them. Her voice was nearly a whisper. "Everything's in there." Nora didn't reach for it right away. She looked at Isabelle, really looked, and saw what it had cost to bring this tiny object this far, across cities, across oceans, across decisions made with shaking hands and sleep-deprived resolve. "I didn't know where else to turn," Isabelle added. Her fingers pulled back, folding into her lap like she'd just placed a part of her soul on that table. Nora reached forward carefully and picked up the crucifix. It was heavier than it looked. She turned it slowly, eyes scanning every curve, until she noticed the tiniest ridge along the horizontal bar of the cross, a hidden seam. She pressed her fingernail along the edge and clicked it open. Inside, barely the size of a thumbnail, sat a micro SD card. Nora stared at it for a beat. The room felt even colder now, like the truth had started leaking from something sealed too long. She stood and motioned to the security officer outside the door. "Bring the encrypted terminal." Within moments, a laptop was rolled in. Hardened, secured, with no external access, the kind used for sensitive evidence handling. The officer plugged in the card with latex-gloved hands. The screen flickered to life. Nora moved behind the monitor. Isabelle didn't follow. She sat still, eyes on her own hands now, refusing to look at what was unfolding, like a wound she'd lived with too long to reopen again. Koda, still beside her, let out a soft huff, then rested his head on his paws. The first file auto-loaded, and the room stopped breathing. Footage, low resolution, fixed angle, a living room, dimly lit, clean. A woman, Isabelle, clutching an infant in her arms. A man enters frame, tall, broad-shouldered, expensive dress shirt. His voice comes first, calm, smooth. And then it changes. Words sharpen, tone escalates. He steps forward, points a finger. She flinches. He grabs her by the arm, hard, shoves her into the wall. The baby begins to cry. The clip ends. Nora said nothing. She clicked to the next file. Medical records, scanned copies, x-rays, fractures, notes from a clinic in San Diego, wrist injury, bruised ribs, a cut to the upper lip, photos attached, then audio files, phone calls, voicemail messages, voice-to-text transcripts, words full of threats, of manipulation wrapped in legality. "You can't win, Isabelle. No judge will give a foreign-born woman custody over an American father. You're unstable. I have recordings. I can prove it." Nora's jaw tightened. The man's name appeared in several documents. Robert Seong, corporate attorney, partner at a high-profile Seattle firm, no criminal record, known donor to law enforcement charities, flawless reputation, on paper. But the paper had lied. And now, it was burning. She looked back at Isabelle, who still hadn't moved. Her silence was no longer hesitation, it was survival. "You were gathering this," Nora finally said, voice hushed. "Piece by piece." Isabelle nodded slowly. "For months. I saved what I could, hid the rest. I didn't know what he'd do if he found out." Her eyes finally met Nora's. "He said if I ran, he'd call it kidnapping. If I stayed, he'd take my son anyway. He said no one would believe me. Not here. Not back home. There was no anger in her voice, only the exhaustion of someone who had run out of places to hide. Nora exhaled and turned the screen slightly toward her. The video was paused, a frame frozen on Isabelle's face mid-flinch, the baby screaming just behind her shoulder. "I believe you," Nora said. And for the first time, Isabelle cried, not from fear, from relief. The footage didn't need music. It didn't need narration. It spoke for itself, frame by frame, pixel by pixel, breath by breath. Nora sat rigid in the chair, arms crossed tightly across her chest, jaw locked as the screen before her played the quiet horror of another woman's private war. The first video flickered to life in grayscale, a baby monitor's fisheye view of a nursery. Isabelle stood in frame, rocking Benjamin slowly, the soft sway of motherhood uninterrupted until the door burst open behind her. Robert Seong, in a perfectly tailored shirt, cufflinks glinting in the dim light. Not yelling. Not yet. He closed the door behind him with a thud that shook the camera. His voice was calm, his words sharp. "You left the lights on again." Isabelle murmured something too soft to hear. He stepped forward. Fast. Not with violence, but with control. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. She flinched, tried to shield the baby, turned her body to keep him away. He didn't hit her. But he didn't need to. He used presence like a weapon. The screen faded to black. Loaded again. Different room, wider angle. A living room this time. A late night. Isabelle sat on the couch holding her phone in her lap, thumb hesitating over the screen. She didn't see him walk in. He didn't yell this time either. He laughed. A quiet, chilling kind of laugh, the kind that doesn't come from humor, but from power. He walked up behind her and whispered something into her ear. She flinched. He reached around and snatched the phone, read the screen, then threw it hard against the wall. Benjamin began to cry in another room. Robert didn't move. The camera didn't blink, and Nora didn't either. She watched, frame after frame, moment after moment, and something cold unfurled in her chest, not surprise, not disgust. Recognition. Because she'd seen this before. Not in footage. In real time. In soldiers who snapped the wrong way. In men who smiled at the camera and broke people off screen. Control wasn't always a scream. Sometimes it was a whisper in a locked room. And sometimes it looked like love. The next clip played automatically. Isabelle stood near a bathroom mirror. Half her face was bruised. She was holding up her phone like a shield, filming herself. "My name is Isabelle Ree," she said quietly. "If something happens to me, it was Robert Seong. He has access to my phone, my emails. He's already started telling people I'm unstable." Her voice cracked. "But I'm not. I know what stable is. I used to be." She reached up, pulled down the collar of her shirt, revealing a line of yellowed bruises. A baby cried again. Muffled this time, distant. She ended the video. The screen dimmed. The room didn't move. Outside the interrogation glass, 2 officers stood in silence, one holding a clipboard that now felt like dead weight. Nora stood. Pause playback. The agent by the laptop clicked the space bar. Static. Nora walked to the window, not to look at Isabelle, but to see her. The woman on the other side hadn't changed position much since before, but something about her posture was different now. Not looser, not broken, just exposed. like a wall had been pulled down and the foundation left standing, cracked but real. She turned to the agent beside her. "Start background on Xiong, not the surface crap. I want access logs, private holdings, law enforcement donations, private investigators, even VPN routing." The agent nodded. "You think he has people watching her?" "I think he has people watching all of us," Nora replied, eyes still on Isabelle. She turned back to the screen. Final clip. This one was longer. Date stamped just 3 weeks ago. Camera angle positioned in a kitchen. Isabelle stood with a diaper bag in hand, keys on the counter. Robert leaned against the fridge, blocking the exit. "I already told you," he said calmly. "You want to go visit your parents? You do it with my approval. You don't take Benjamin without telling me." "I left you a note," Isabelle whispered. "That's not permission." He stepped forward. She stepped back, bumped into the high chair. He slammed a palm on the wall beside her head, not touching her, but close enough to make her flinch violently. "You ever do that again," he said, voice as smooth as silk, "I'll make sure no court in this country gives you so much as supervised visitation." And then, softer, "No one's going to believe a trembling little translator from Seoul over a Harvard-educated citizen of the law." The camera held on Isabelle's face for several seconds after he left the frame, frozen, wide-eyed, alone. When the video ended, no one moved. No one cleared their throat. The room had lost all pretense of neutrality. Isabelle hadn't handed them evidence. She'd handed them a record of slow, strategic erasure. And it hadn't worked, because one dog had seen through it, because one bark had cracked the silence. For a long time, Isabelle didn't speak. She just sat at the table, fingers laced together, her eyes trained not on Nora, not on the officers, not even on the screen that had just played the worst parts of her life in sequence. She stared at the edge of the table, as if it were a cliff. And maybe it was. Nora didn't interrupt the silence. She let it stretch, not as a tactic, but as respect. Some truths don't come out under pressure. They come when the weight finally lifts, even just a little. Koda lay curled in the corner now, watching, ears pricked forward, still. "He was going to take my son." Isabelle's voice didn't shake this time. It wasn't loud, but it was solid. Nora leaned forward slightly. "What makes you say that?" Isabelle exhaled slowly, like air that had been trapped inside her lungs too long. "I found a message, left open on his laptop. He was emailing a friend of his at a family law firm in Vancouver. Said I was showing signs of increasing emotional instability, that he had enough material to petition for full custody on the grounds of safety." She paused. "He even wrote that the only reason he hadn't moved yet was because he didn't want a public scene. Not before his promotion." Nora's chest tightened, but her face remained steady. "And the gun?" Isabelle closed her eyes for a moment, not to hide, but to gather herself. When she opened them again, they were clearer. "I knew where he kept it. Locked case under the bed. I used to clean the room, change the linens. He never thought I'd look inside." "You're trained with firearms?" "I had to be," she said. "I lived with him." The words hung in the air like frost. "I didn't take it to use it," she added. "I took it because I didn't want to vanish." She looked at Nora then, finally, really looked. And what Nora saw wasn't defiance. It was resolve. "Men like Robert," Isabelle continued, "they erase you slowly. First from the conversation, then from the decisions, then from the paperwork. And by the time you realize it, your name isn't on anything anymore. Not the bank accounts, not the lease, not even your child's medical forms. She swallowed. And then one day, you overhear a call. You hear him talking like you're already gone, and you realize, she blinked, that he's just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. So you ran. I didn't know if I'd make it through the airport, but I had to try. She looked down, voice softening. San Francisco wasn't the original destination. I changed flights in Seoul after I thought I saw someone, one of Robert's old security guys. He had them follow me before. I used a different name on the booking, packed only for 3 days. No photos, no devices, just the necklace and my son. She hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly again, but she didn't stop. I taped the gun under the stroller because I knew Robert. He'd never look there. He never touched it, never changed a diaper, never cleaned it. It was invisible to him, just like I was. Silence. I didn't want to shoot anyone, she said quietly. I didn't even want to carry it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I made one wrong turn, someone would drag me back, and no one would believe me. Nora nodded slowly. And now? Isabelle met her gaze, a flicker of steel beneath the exhaustion. Now, I just want my son to grow up somewhere where no one flinches when he cries, somewhere I don't have to rehearse my answers before asking for help. Nora sat with that for a long moment. Then she leaned back in her chair, eyes never leaving the woman across from her. You're not the one on trial here, Isabelle. You're the one who survived. A single tear slid down Isabelle's cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. I don't want to be brave anymore, she said. I just want to be left alone to be his mom. Koda stood then. Not fast, not noisy, just stood. Walked over to her side, rested his head against her thigh. She looked down. Her hand moved to his fur again. Slow, certain. I think he understands, she whispered. Nora nodded. He always does? Outside the interview room, the world resumed its motion. Security radios crackled, keyboards clacked, coffee machines hissed to life. But inside Nora, something remained still. She stood near the observation window, arms folded, watching Koda lean quietly against Isabelle's leg. It was such a small gesture. But Nora had learned long ago, it was never just a gesture with Koda. There was a precision to his instincts, a patience, and above all, a choice. He didn't give trust. He offered it, when he chose to. And not everyone earned it. Not at first. Nora's eyes softened, and for a moment she wasn't standing in a sterile government hallway. She was back in that gravel-paved lot behind the K-9 training unit in Fort Lewis, where the sun beat down like a hammer and the air reeked of doubt. Her boots were new then, her badge temporary. The pain in her leg still flared every time she stepped too hard, the souvenir of a blast that had taken a teammate, and nearly her. But the limp wasn't what made people whisper. It was the silence, the stiffness in her eyes, the way she no longer looked at civilians like she believed they could protect themselves. Specialist Nora Vance, the K-9 commander had said, not looking up from his clipboard. We've got a dog you can trial. He's a little different. She followed him past 2 rows of kennels. Most of the dogs barked, tails wagging, bodies pacing with anticipation. All but one, the last kennel. The German shepherd sat in the far corner, muzzle lowered, ears alert but unmoving. His coat was dark sable, his eyes darker. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply watched them. You're kidding, Nora had muttered. "He looks like he's waiting to kill somebody." "He's failed 3 handler matches," the commander replied. "Not aggressive, not lazy, just doesn't follow protocol. Refuses commands if he doesn't trust the person giving them." "Isn't that a problem?" she asked. The commander shrugged. "Or a gift. Depends on who's holding the leash." And that's how she met Koda. Their first training session was a disaster. He ignored every order: sit, stay, track, return, wouldn't engage, wouldn't make eye contact. But he didn't bolt either, didn't snap. He just assessed her. Every move she made. The instructors had called him stubborn, defective. But Nora knew better. He was waiting. So she stopped giving orders. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the edge of the training field, tossed a tennis ball into the dirt, and spoke to him like a soldier she hadn't earned yet. "I know what it's like to have someone bark at you and expect obedience," she had said softly. "I also know what it's like to lose everything and still be told to heal faster." Koda had tilted his head slightly, his ears twitching, but he didn't move. The next day, she returned. Same spot, same ball, no commands. And on the third day, Koda walked over. Not because she called, but because she hadn't. From that moment, everything changed. They trained harder than anyone, but not louder. Koda didn't need shouts. He needed truth, consistency, calm beneath pressure. Nora wasn't the handler who broke him in. She was the handler who understood his silence. Back in the present, Nora let the memory fade. Her gaze shifted again to the scene in front of her. Isabelle, her fingers still resting lightly on the fur behind Koda's neck. She hadn't moved in minutes, and Koda hadn't either. He wasn't guarding, he wasn't working, he was witnessing, like he always had. "Why that dog?" someone had once asked her, early in her customs assignment. "You know you could have chosen one of the easier ones." She'd looked them straight in the eye. "Because the hard ones," she said, "know how to spot what the rest of us miss." Now, staring at the woman behind the glass, broken but breathing, hunted but not hiding, she knew this was one of those moments, the kind no protocol prepared you for, and the kind Koda always saw coming. When Agent Diane Powell entered the room, she brought with her a different kind of silence, the kind that didn't tiptoe or whisper. It assessed, calculated, listened without noise. She wore no blazer, no badge on display, just a soft gray shirt, dark slacks, a thin folder tucked under one arm. Her brown hair was clipped back neatly, her steps unfussy. And yet, the agents who stood around the evidence table instinctively cleared space for her, like they'd just seen something step out of a sealed file. Nora stood up when she entered. "Agent Powell?" she greeted quietly. Diane nodded once. "Vance, good to see you again. I read the initial report." "It's worse than the report," Nora said. "And it's deeper." Diane laid the folder on the table and took a seat in front of the encrypted laptop. Her eyes flicked over the screen, paused at the list of file names extracted from the micro SD. Surveillance clips, PDFs, audio files, metadata. "Who gave you this?" she asked. Nora gestured toward the one-way glass. Isabelle sat beyond it, arms wrapped loosely around herself like a woman made entirely of tension and thread. Koda was curled at her feet like a shadow with a heartbeat. "She's the victim, and the source." Diane didn't comment. She just clicked open the next file. A spreadsheet populated the screen, foreign wire transfers from a shell company in Macau, funneled through a trust in Vancouver. The name Seong Holdings appeared in the top right corner. "Jesus," Diane muttered under her breath. She clicked into another folder, audio logs, one labeled Voice Record 0219 M4A. She played it. The recording quality was sharp, painfully so. Robert Seong's voice filled the room, calm, smooth, amused. "She thinks she can run. But I've already spoken to Judge Henley. She owes me too much to say no. And if Vasilev still handles internal affairs over at ICE, then I'll get the expedited seizure order by next week. If she leaves the country, it becomes international custody interference. Let her try." The clip stopped. No one in the room said anything for a long moment. "Play that again," Diane said. Nora replayed it. This time Diane took notes. Her pen didn't pause. "Henley's a sitting family court judge in Seattle," she said. "And Vasilev retired from ICE 2 years ago. But he's consulting now," Nora added. "Private sector. Still has reach." Diane clicked into the third file. A signed affidavit, doctored, showing Isabelle diagnosed with postpartum psychosis. The header was real. The signature, forged. The report had been generated through a falsified clinic ID tied to a shuttered women's health facility that had lost its license 6 months earlier. Nora recognized the name instantly. "She told me he locked her out of her own bank accounts," she said. "Told everyone she was spiraling after the birth. This file makes it official." Diane's voice was low, controlled. He was building a legal cage around her, so when she finally did run, she'd already looked guilty. "Is it enough?" Nora asked. Diane didn't answer immediately. She kept clicking through documents, one after another, a chain of digital breadcrumbs leading through a forest of polished lies. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned a PDF. A closed settlement with a former employee of Seong's firm. Sexual harassment, sealed. A second settlement, financial coercion, a non-disclosure agreement. "It's more than enough to launch an investigation," Diane said finally. "But it's also enough to get her killed if the wrong people know she came forward." Nora stiffened. "You think he's watching her movements?" "I think Robert Seong doesn't let go of what he thinks belongs to him, and I think Isabelle is the one thing he couldn't legally own, so now he's trying to destroy her instead." There was nothing dramatic about how Diane said it. It was fact. Cold, stark, like opening a closet and finding no ghosts, just a loaded gun with fingerprints wiped clean. Nora exhaled. She stared down at the open files, the audio log still playing faintly from the background folder. "You've seen this before?" she asked. "Too many times," Diane replied. "Men like Robert don't always punch with fists. Sometimes they punch with influence, and that's harder to trace. But this," she gestured toward the screen, "this is a paper trail wrapped in a noose." She turned to Nora, voice lower. "Your instincts were right. But instinct alone won't protect her. This has to be handled off-grid for now. Quiet investigation, temporary protections. We go loud before we're ready, and he'll vanish, or worse, come after the boy." Nora looked through the glass again. Isabelle hadn't moved, but Koda had. He was sitting upright now, watching, always watching. "She risked everything to bring this here," Nora said. "We can't let him erase her again." Diane nodded. "We won't." And for the first time in hours, the air in the room shifted, not with resolution, but with readiness, because now the truth wasn't just held, it was moving. The protection suite at the federal safe house wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, quiet, and locked down like a vault. The lights were dimmed. The hum of the HVAC system was the only thing that dared break the silence. Outside, the Seattle night had folded itself into cold fog and distant ferry horns. Somewhere, life moved on as usual. But not here. Not tonight. Isabelle had finally drifted into sleep, her first real sleep in what had likely been days. She lay curled on the cot in the corner of the room, one arm wrapped protectively around her son Benjamin. His tiny fingers clung to the edge of her sweatshirt, mouth parted in an innocent kind of trust that seemed almost unbearable in its purity. The baby's breathing was soft, even, and for once his sleep wasn't interrupted by muffled yelling or crashing glass. But Koda didn't sleep. He sat by the door, perfectly still, not lounging, not pacing, posted, like a soldier who'd tasted too much war to ever let his guard down. His ears twitched occasionally at a hallway creak, the soft buzz of a motion sensor. His nose flared when the wind pressed against the edges of the weather seal under the steel-reinforced door. And his eyes, those deep, discerning eyes, never left the seam where door met frame. Nora sat across the room watching him. She had tried to coax him earlier. "Rest, Koda. We're safe." But he hadn't budged. He hadn't even blinked. Now, as the hour pushed past midnight, Nora leaned against the wall, a throw blanket over her lap, tablet dimmed beside her. Her mind buzzed too loudly to read. Her eyes drifted again to Koda. He had always been like this, especially when the danger hadn't passed, even if everyone else thought it had. "Koda," she whispered, not to command, but to understand. He didn't turn, didn't make a sound. But his body, taut with alertness, told her what she already suspected. He still smelled something wrong. Not in the room, not in the air, but in the space between moments where instinct could live long before evidence caught up. Nora stood slowly and crossed the room, quietly, deliberately. She crouched beside him, her knees cracking gently in protest, and laid her hand on his back. He didn't flinch, but he didn't relax either. "You know something I don't?" she said softly, her voice barely a breath. "Don't you?" Koda's ears shifted slightly forward. His body remained locked. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. The kind that came from a history of danger never announcing itself. And suddenly, Nora remembered a training officer's words from long ago. "Some dogs are born to obey, but the ones who learn to wait, to judge, they're the ones you trust with your life." Koda didn't wait for orders. He waited for truth. And tonight, even in silence, he was speaking. Nora rose slowly and scanned the room. Nothing out of place. No red flags. Every exit sealed. Every digital log double-verified. Even Powell had personally swept the safe house earlier. So why wouldn't he rest? Because something was still out there. Or someone. She glanced at Isabelle and Benjamin, both breathing gently under the pale blue blanket. And then back at Koda. Whatever storm was coming, he intended to meet it first. Nora turned off the remaining lights. She didn't say good night, didn't offer a command. She simply sat down beside the door, shoulder brushing the dog, who had never let her walk blind. And together they waited, not in fear, but in the stillness only survivors understood. The cafeteria at the safe house smelled like overbrewed coffee and microwave meals, but it was quiet, and that mattered more than comfort. Isabelle sat across from Nora, fingers curled around a ceramic mug she hadn't touched. The coffee had gone cold. Outside the reinforced windows, morning tried to break through a thin sheet of rain, turning the glass into a blur of gray and silver. It felt like the kind of day where the world didn't rush. And maybe that was why she finally spoke. "It didn't start the way people think," Isabelle said, her voice low, almost embarrassed by its own sound. Nora didn't interrupt. She just nodded, gently, and waited. Robert was charming. That's the word. But not in a fake way. He remembered my order at a coffee shop after meeting me once. Held doors, wrote me little notes. Isabelle paused. He was brilliant, cultured, magnetic. I felt chosen. Nora watched the way Isabelle stared past her mug like it was a tunnel back to another life. "The first time he insulted me, it wasn't even harsh. He joked that I should dye my hair to look more professional. Then later he said he only said it because he wanted me to succeed, that he cared." "And you believed him?" Nora asked softly. "I wanted to," Isabelle said. "He made it feel like he was the only one who could really see me, that if I didn't listen, I was throwing away something precious." There was a tremble in her fingers now, barely noticeable, except to someone like Nora, who had learned to read trauma not by the wounds it showed, but by the ones it hid in silence. "Then came the control," Isabelle continued. "He'd text me constantly. 'Where are you? Who's that in the photo?' At first it felt romantic, like someone worried, protective even." She exhaled sharply, bitterness tightening her jaw. "But it wasn't protection. It was surveillance. And when I pushed back, things shifted." Nora leaned forward. "How did it escalate?" Isabelle's voice cracked. "One night I came home 15 minutes late. I'd stopped at the pharmacy without telling him. He was waiting in the kitchen, said I'd made him worry sick." Her eyes met Nora's now, and they weren't distant anymore. "They always say it starts with a slap, but it didn't. He didn't raise his voice. He just grabbed my wrist, tight, too tight. He said, 'Do you understand how scared I was?' And you apologized," Nora said quietly. Isabelle nodded, the shame like static in her throat. "I said I'd never do it again. And he kissed my forehead." The next part came slower. Then came the slap. Weeks later. Then the threats. And eventually, punches. She looked down at her arm, at nothing, like the memory had left bruises invisible to everyone but her. "I remember standing in front of a mirror once after he called me worthless, and I said it back to my own reflection. 'You're crazy. You ruin everything.' I didn't even hear my voice anymore. I heard his." Nora swallowed hard. "Why didn't you leave?" Isabelle's lips twitched, not in humor, but as if fighting against an answer that had burned her too long. "Because he was a lawyer, a public figure, the son of a diplomat, and I was just—" She shrugged. "Just a girl from Busan who wanted to paint for a living. I had no family here. No one would have believed me. And he reminded me of that every time I got the courage to look at the door." She fell silent for a long time. Then she added, "But then Benjamin came." Her voice changed, softened. "When I held him the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt like I was looking at something pure, untouched by him." She ran her fingertip slowly around the rim of the mug. "And that's when I knew if I stayed, he'd grow up thinking this was normal, thinking this was love." Nora's chest tightened. She'd heard war stories in uniform, seen men cry beside bomb craters and empty beds, but nothing had ever pierced quite like a mother's voice trying to reclaim her truth from beneath years of erasure. "You weren't crazy," Nora said. Isabelle looked up. "No," she agreed softly. "I was surviving. That's what abuse makes you do. It rewires your sense of normal until the pain becomes just another routine." A silence settled again. But this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt necessary. Then Nora asked one last question. "Do you still blame yourself?" Isabelle's eyes welled, but she didn't cry. She blinked slowly, shook her head. "Not anymore. I look at Benjamin, and I know I didn't escape because I was weak. I escaped because I remembered who I was, because he reminded me." Nora reached across the table. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't say, "You're brave." She just placed her hand over Isabelle's and let it rest there. Because sometimes the most powerful response wasn't a word. It was presence. It was nearly 2 a.m. in Seoul when Isabelle first realized the walls of her world were closing in for good. Benjamin was asleep in the crib, finally, his soft breaths barely audible over the hum of the monitor. The apartment was silent, carved from sleek glass and cold angles, a penthouse that should have symbolized success, but instead felt like a cage wrapped in velvet. She was walking past the study on her way to the laundry room when she heard it. Robert's voice, muffled, low, but clear. She stopped, froze mid-step. The door was slightly ajar. "I have the documentation ready. She's already unstable. We have the psychiatric reports filed. I just need the final clearance before we leave. Once I have that, I'll take the boy and she'll be out of our lives." Her body locked, not in fear, not this time, in finality. Her brain couldn't keep up with the adrenaline that slammed into her chest like a steel plate. She stepped backward silently, automatically, and ducked into the darkened hallway. She stood in the shadows for almost 5 full minutes, listening. He was calm, methodical, laughing, like it was all business, like tearing a mother from her child was just one more checkbox on his carefully groomed agenda. That night, Isabelle didn't cry. She packed, quietly, deliberately. She didn't take photos or keepsakes, no jewelry, no books, just diapers, formula, 2 spare sets of clothes, and a folded blanket with Benjamin's name embroidered in the corner. She slipped a passport from the hidden drawer in the closet, the one she'd made months ago under the name Sujin Ri, just in case. Just in case. The gun came next. She didn't shake when she loaded it. It wasn't courage. It was instinct. The kind women aren't born with, but are forced to learn. She wrapped the Glock in layers of cloth and tucked it under the bottom cushion of the baby stroller, below the storage pouch. It was heavy, too heavy, but she had no other place. And if Robert found her first, no explanation would matter. By dawn, she was already in the taxi. Benjamin blinked up at her from his carrier with wide, trusting eyes. He didn't cry once. Maybe he sensed what she couldn't say, that this wasn't just an escape. It was a rescue mission, and she was rescuing them both. Her original plan was Tokyo, then Vancouver. She'd mapped the whole route in her head months ago during those nights when she pretended sleep but lay awake measuring terror in hours. But then, at the transfer terminal in Narita, she saw him. A man in a charcoal suit, dark glasses, no luggage. He didn't walk like a traveler. He scanned like a predator. And when their eyes met, something in Isabelle's gut twisted violently. She turned on her heel, heart thudding, and found the next departing international flight, United Airlines, non-stop to San Francisco. She paid in cash, No hesitation. She didn't look back. The plane was nearly full. She sat in the last row closest to the bathrooms. Benjamin whimpered through takeoff, but eventually fell asleep with his face buried against her collarbone. Isabelle didn't sleep at all. She watched every passenger, tracked every movement, flinched at every glance, and when the customs officer in San Francisco asked why she was visiting the U.S., she smiled and said, "Vacation," like the word didn't feel like a lie. But vacationers don't carry guns. They don't look over their shoulders in every hallway. They don't listen for footsteps the way others listen for music. She had no idea where she was going next. No plan beyond survival. But the moment she stepped off that plane, she knew one thing. She wasn't his anymore. And if she had to die proving it, so be it. But Benjamin would live. That was the deal she made with herself. In the air, over the sea, that was the promise. And for that promise, she would risk everything, even her life. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something warmer like dust that had been disturbed for the first time in years. Not medical, not police, just human. And in that space between trauma and truth, Isabelle sat shoulders straighter than before, eyes darker but steadier. Agent Diane Powell leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed, not accusatory, but deliberate. "Why didn't you declare the weapon?" she asked quietly. It wasn't an interrogation. Not anymore. Isabelle looked up slowly. Her hands were folded in her lap as if she were still holding on to something, perhaps her own restraint. Her answer didn't come right away. Because it wasn't just about the gun. It never was. After a long silence, she said, "Because no one believes women like me." Her voice didn't shake. It was tired, threadbare, but unwavering. They believe the resume, the suit, the money, the reputation. They believe a man with power when he says, "She's unstable." They don't question it. They don't see the bruises beneath the designer's sleeves. They don't hear what happens behind doors closed by privilege. She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then, "I wasn't planning to use it. I just—" She stopped. "I didn't want to disappear." Powell's expression didn't soften, but something in her eyes did. It was Koda who moved first. He had been lying in the corner, quiet as a shadow, watching. Not panting, not restless, just watching. His gaze fixed not on Isabelle's face, but on something deeper, something people often missed. He stood, walked across the room, and without a sound he sat beside her. Isabelle looked down, startled, but didn't pull away. Koda didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply rested his chin gently on top of her foot. The weight was barely anything, but the meaning, it was everything. Her breath caught in her chest. A tight, invisible knot inside her unraveled one she hadn't even known she was still holding. A laugh, soft, stunned, involuntary, escaped her. And for the first time since she had stepped into this country, under a name not her own, Isabelle Rhee smiled. It wasn't a big smile. Not the kind that erases pain or pretends it didn't happen. It was smaller, truer. The kind of smile that emerges not because the storm has passed, but because someone finally offered her shelter while it raged. She looked at Koda, eyes shimmering. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew I wasn't dangerous." Neither Powell nor Nora said a word. They didn't have to. Because in that single still moment, surrounded by files and facts and faded hopes, a German shepherd had rendered the only verdict that mattered. And it wasn't written in law. It was written in trust. The micro SD card clicked into place with a faint metallic snap. For a moment, no one in the room breathed. Nora stood behind Agent Diane Powell, who sat in front of a government-issued laptop in the secure operations room at the field office. The lights were dimmed partly for the screen, mostly for what they were about to see. Isabelle sat off to the side, arms folded tight against her chest. Koda lay at her feet like a living statue, head raised, ears sharp. The folder structure appeared first. Dozens of directories, some labeled plainly, others in cold, cryptic codes. Powell's fingers moved methodically over the trackpad, navigating through folders labeled Therapy Logs Revised, Custody Strategy, Kim Audio Modified, Judicial Liaison Chain. Each name hit like a quiet blow. Nora leaned forward. Start with the mental health reports. Powell opened the PDF. It was a psychiatric evaluation on Isabelle, except the date didn't match any real doctor visit she'd mentioned, and the signature? A quick cross-reference confirmed it. The psychiatrist listed had passed away 5 years earlier. Powell narrowed her eyes. He forged an evaluation from a dead man. Jesus, Nora muttered under her breath. They kept digging. Video files surfaced next. One showed Isabelle in their old apartment. She was mid-sentence, eyes wide, words escalating, angry, upset. But something felt off. Powell played it again, slowed it down. The background audio had been clipped and looped. The original video was cut and spliced, removing the start of the conversation, framing Isabelle as erratic. On the desk in the video, a baby bottle full. Benjamin had already been fed. Smart, Powell murmured. He edited the clip to make her look like a neglectful, unstable mother. And that was just the start. In one folder, email chains surfaced. Internal memos between Robert and high-ranking legal consultants. Names were redacted sloppily, but metadata revealed city servers tied to the sole judiciary system. Payoffs, favor exchanges, suggested rulings. God, Nora whispered. It's not just about her. He's been building a paper trail to bury any woman who crosses him. Powell opened a folder marked Settlements. It was filled with NDA templates, digital payments, scanned signatures. Former assistants, a nanny, a girlfriend from 5 years ago. Each agreement was almost identical. Silence in exchange for a future. A job, tuition, freedom. Isabelle couldn't look anymore. She turned her face to the wall, one hand over her mouth. This isn't domestic violence, Powell said finally. This is structural abuse. She looked over at Nora, eyes colder than before. This man's entire career is a machine built to erase women like her. And he's used the system to grease every gear. Nora's jaw tightened. And if this had never surfaced, if Koda hadn't stopped her at that gate, she'd be a headline by now, Powell finished. Or worse, forgotten. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, heavy with the weight of everything this card now represented, not just a woman's bruises, but the bruises carved into the system itself, hidden behind courtroom walls, false diagnoses, and impeccable suits. Koda shifted slightly, exhaling low as if sensing the shift in atmosphere. Powell glanced down at him. We're not just protecting her anymore, she said. We're blowing the whole thing open. Nora nodded once. It wasn't justice yet, but it was finally a start. By the time the sun bled over the horizon, painting the edges of the sky in cold amber, the walls inside the federal field office felt like they were vibrating. Not from noise, but from velocity. Things were moving now. Fast. Agent Diane Powell didn't knock when she entered the operations room. She strode in with her phone still pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent. Yes, all of it. Mental health falsification, judicial corruption, surveillance tampering. We're initiating emergency protocol. A pause. Then, yes, sir. We'll need federal oversight. She ended the call with a clipped motion, then turned to Nora and the others in the room. Her face had shed whatever doubt remained. The FBI is in. Nora exhaled. Not relief, but confirmation. They had crossed the threshold. This was no longer about what one woman suffered. It was about what the system let happen. "What's next?" Nora asked. Powell tossed a red-sealed folder onto the desk. "A federal prosecutor's being flown in from D.C. today. Special division cases involving institutional abuse and judicial compromise. Name's Braddock. Doesn't blink unless he smells blood." She turned toward the hallway. "We need Isabelle moved, now." The transfer happened within the hour. 2 black SUVs pulled into the underground lot. No lights, no markings. Isabelle stood quietly beside Nora. Benjamin nestled against her shoulder, thumb in his mouth, eyes wide but calm. There were no cuffs, no chains. Just a quiet urgency in every movement around her. Officers moved with deference, not suspicion, as if they'd read the files, as if they finally believed her. A female marshal approached. "We're authorized for relocation and protective status. You'll be safe." Isabelle nodded. She didn't speak, but her arms wrapped tighter around her son. Powell emerged with another document in hand. "Emergency protective orders are filed. Robert Seong is to remain 500 miles away from you and the child. Violation will trigger federal charges." Then she paused. "And the courts issued a temporary custody grant. Full parental authority. Effective immediately." Isabelle blinked. Her knees softened beneath her. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt like a rescue helicopter landing in the middle of a long, frozen night. She turned to Nora. "Does this mean he can't take Benjamin?" Nora didn't answer with words. She reached into her vest, removed a plastic sleeve, and placed it gently into Isabelle's hands. The ink was still fresh. The judge's seal pressed into the corner like a brand of hope. "He won't touch either of you again," Nora said. And for the first time, Isabelle allowed herself to believe it. Koda stood at the side entrance, watching as Isabelle and Benjamin were ushered into the armored SUV. His tail didn't wag, he didn't bark, but his head tilted just slightly as if assessing the air. There was no siren, no flashing red light, but make no mistake, the alarm had already been sounded. And justice was awake now. It started as a whisper, a blog post, anonymous, 4 paragraphs long, titled only, "He Was Always Watching." Within 2 hours it had 4,000 views. By nightfall it had gone viral. The woman didn't give her real name, but she gave enough dates, patterns, and phrases Robert Seong had used that felt surgically aimed to dismantle her confidence. She ended with 3 words that struck like thunder. "I wasn't alone." By morning the silence cracked open. A former intern at Seong and Drake came forward. Then an ex-girlfriend from his Yale law years. A paralegal from Seoul. A former assistant who had signed a non-disclosure agreement but tore it up and scanned the shredded pieces onto her Instagram story with the caption, "Your empire ends here." News outlets circled like hawks. But it wasn't the headlines that mattered, it was the women. Each story, almost copy-pasted from the last, different names, same terror. Emotional strangulation dressed in tailored suits. Gaslighting hidden under business cards. Security footage, emails, transcripts. Bits and fragments that, on their own, meant nothing. Together, they were a war cry. Nora watched the coverage from the break room at the field office. The screen showed Robert exiting his high-rise, surrounded by press. His expression didn't falter, smooth, unshaken, still cloaked in the privilege of image. But Nora saw it, the tick in his jaw, the way his hand curled slightly tighter around his briefcase. "He's bleeding," Powell murmured beside her. "He just doesn't know it yet." On the bulletin board behind them, a map was pinned. Red threads crisscrossed jurisdictions, victims, timelines, legal connections, a spider web no longer invisible. Powell added a new photo, another survivor, another voice no longer afraid of its own echo. Nora looked at it, then glanced down. Koda sat at her feet, watching the door, still alert, still listening, still waiting for the next silence to break. That night, Isabelle's phone lit up with a text, a number she didn't recognize. The message was short. "I read your story. Mine's the same. Thank you for surviving." She stared at the screen, a long breath leaving her lungs like a prayer, finally answered. In the hallway, Benjamin slept in a portable crib, thumb in mouth, feet twitching with dreams. And in the corner Koda stood, not guarding, but witnessing. The shadows weren't gone, but they were outnumbered now. The car pulled up to a building with no sign, just beige stucco walls, a shaded entryway, and a gate that clicked shut with finality. It didn't look like safety. It didn't need to. It was. Isabelle stepped out slowly, Benjamin in her arms, his cheek pressed to her shoulder. He wasn't crying anymore. He hadn't since they crossed the California border. As if, in some quiet way, even his tiny body knew the danger was behind them for now. Nora walked beside her, Koda leading with an easy gait, leash slack. They'd made the 6-hour drive mostly in silence, stopping only once for coffee and a diaper change. Isabelle had spoken little, but her eyes stayed open, not scanning anymore, just observing, learning how to live without fear being the default setting. "This is it," Nora said gently. "No names listed in public records, no photos, 24-hour security, just other women. Like you." Isabelle looked at the building again, the curtains in the windows, the wind chimes swaying silently in the shade. "It's quiet," she whispered. "Exactly," Nora replied. Inside, the staff welcomed her with warmth that didn't feel rehearsed. No pity, no plastic smiles, just kindness, unpolished, steady. A counselor named Miriam showed her to the small room she and Benjamin would share. Twin beds, worn quilt, nightlight already plugged in. "It's not much," Miriam said, "but no one will yell here, no one will corner you, and no one will touch your child without asking first." Isabelle nodded, throat tight. She didn't unpack that night. She just sat at the edge of the bed, Benjamin curled in her lap, staring out the window at a garden she hadn't even realized was there. And for the first time in years, she fell asleep without clutching her phone like a lifeline. The days moved slow. Breakfast was at 7, therapy at 10, peer groups in the afternoon, journaling, walks in the courtyard. Breathwork. Healing didn't look like magic. It looked like routine, like eating 3 times a day without needing to throw it up from nerves, like hearing your name spoken without flinching, like letting your son play 5 feet away and not fearing he'd vanish the second you blinked. Koda and Nora returned 4 days later. Isabelle was in the garden, pruning dead leaves off a stubborn lavender bush, Benjamin chasing a butterfly with toddler steps. Koda spotted them first. He didn't bark, just trotted forward, tail swaying once before he reached Isabelle's side and nudged her knee. She didn't jump. She turned and smiled, A soft, tired smile, but a real one. "You came back." Nora leaned on the fence. "He insisted." They sat for an hour. Didn't talk about the case. Didn't talk about Robert. Just the heat, the lavender, the way Benjamin laughed now, unafraid and full-bodied, like he had nothing to unlearn. "He's sleeping better," Isabelle said. "So are you," Nora noted. There was a pause. Then Isabelle asked, almost shy, "Do you think it's okay if I start not looking over my shoulder every second?" Nora didn't answer. Koda did. He walked ahead, settled into the grass, and laid down fully for the first time in weeks, his eyes closed, and for once he slept. The moment came quietly. There was no dramatic music, no applause, no bright, sweeping revelation. Just a garden bench, a soft breeze, and the tiny sound of a toddler's voice breaking the air like sunlight cracking through overcast. "Koda?" Isabelle froze mid-step. Her pruning scissors hung in the air, halfway between lavender and air. She turned. Benjamin stood wobbling on chubby legs in the grass, arms out, grinning like he'd discovered gold. In front of him, Koda sat calmly, tail sweeping the earth once, then again. "Koda!" he shouted again, this time with more certainty, tiny hands clapping in excitement. The German shepherd tilted his head at the sound. Not startled, not confused. Just listening, recognizing. And then, as if he understood the gravity of what had just happened, he padded forward and gently pressed his nose against Benjamin's cheek. The boy squealed in delight, and Isabelle, she laughed. Not a polite smile, not the reflexive laugh people give when they don't know what else to do. This one rose from somewhere deeper, somewhere untouched by fear or calculation, a laugh that came out of her like something startled free from a locked place inside her chest. She clutched her side as it spilled out of her raw, warm, uncontrollable. Benjamin joined in, not knowing why, only that Mommy was laughing and the dog he loved was still here. Later that day, as she sat in a shaded corner of the garden journaling, Isabelle wrote one sentence at the top of the page. "I forgot what my own voice sounded like when it was happy." Koda became Benjamin's shadow. Where the boy crawled, he followed. When the boy napped, he stood watch. When Benjamin knocked over his juice or threw a tantrum about shoes, Koda simply lay nearby, steadfast, unshaken, always watching. One of the other women at the center leaned over one day and whispered to Isabelle, "He's not a dog. He's a lighthouse." Isabelle blinked at that. But later that night she found herself repeating the word quietly, fingers brushing Koda's back as he settled beside her. Lighthouse. And the dog, true to form, didn't respond with a bark or movement. Just presence. Healing didn't arrive with a roar. It came in hums. The hum of Benjamin babbling to himself as he played with blocks. The hum of the kitchen radio playing soft jazz in the morning. The hum of the wind through the bougainvillea outside her window. It was quiet. It was slow. But it was steady. Isabelle caught herself one evening humming too. Washing bottles, sun setting through the window, a tune she didn't remember learning. It just came. She stopped for a second, set the bottle down, then whispered, almost to herself, "I'm still here." In the hallway, Koda lifted his head, but didn't move. He didn't have to. He knew. The room was plain, just a circle of chairs, a pot of stale coffee in the corner, and the smell of old paperbacks clinging to the air. But for Isabelle, walking into that room felt harder than boarding the plane out of Seoul, harder than hiding a gun under a stroller, harder than silence. There were 7 women already seated. A few glanced up, some nodded, one smiled. No one stared. A counselor gestured gently. "Take your time. Any chair." Isabelle chose the one closest to the exit. Instinct, maybe. Habit. But her hands didn't tremble this time. She looked around. Scars. Some visible, most not. One woman had a faded bruise above her cheekbone. Another wore a medical bracelet. But what caught Isabelle most wasn't the pain etched into their faces. It was the fact that they were here, still breathing, still choosing to speak. They went around the circle slowly, first names only, no pressure, just presence. When it came to her, Isabelle hesitated. She felt the words clawing up her throat. Her mind offered a dozen escape routes. Say, "You're not ready," just say pass. Pretend you're just here to listen. But then, Koda's name surfaced in her thoughts like a stone dropped into still water, his stillness at her side, his verdict, silent but certain. She took a breath. "I'm Isabelle," she said, "and I didn't come here to tell you I'm strong. I came because I wasn't." No one corrected her. No gasps, no pity. Just silence, warm, open. She continued, voice quieter. "If I survived him, I can survive this." Later that afternoon, Nora met her outside the center. She was leaning against her car, sipping lukewarm tea from a travel mug. Koda lay beside her, eyes half-lidded in the shade, but ears still attuned to everything. Isabelle approached, the breeze tugging her hair loose from its tie. "He made me feel like surviving was failure," she said, not waiting for a hello. "Like running meant I was weak, like crying meant I lost." Nora didn't rush to respond, just looked at her, then looked down at Koda. "You know," she said slowly, "Koda was almost discharged from the program. Too stubborn, too intuitive. He wouldn't follow commands from handlers he didn't trust." She crouched and scratched the dog behind the ear. They called him a liability, said he was unteachable, but he didn't need to be broken, he just needed someone who spoke the same language. Isabelle lowered herself to the sidewalk next to Koda, her knees brushing the concrete. The dog shifted, placing his paw just barely across her foot. Nora's voice softened. "Surviving isn't weakness. It's resistance." Isabelle turned that over in her head. Not an escape, not a retreat, but a refusal to be erased. The sky above them stretched wide and blue. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just open. And in that moment, Isabelle wasn't looking behind her. She was breathing forward, one inhale at a time. The courtroom was colder than expected, not by temperature but by design. Marble walls, high ceilings, and silence sharpened to a sterile edge. It was the kind of place where justice was supposed to feel noble. Instead, it felt clinical, like the world outside had been shut off, and all that remained was judgment. Robert Xiong walked in, with all the ease of a man who still believed the world bent for him. Tailored suit, watch glinting at the cuff, hair meticulously parted. Even his gait was calculated a slow, deliberate saunter, like the trial was just another meeting on his calendar. He didn't look at Isabelle, not once, not when she stepped through the courtroom doors, not when she passed him on the way to the plaintiff's bench, not even when she sat down, shoulders square, hands steady, chin lifted, because men like him didn't stare down what they thought they'd already buried. The bailiff called order. The judge entered. Proceedings began. Robert's lawyer stood first, polished, practiced. She painted Robert as the real victim, a devoted father, a man wronged by the woman he tried to help. She called Isabelle troubled, unstable, evasive. Words like scalpels, sharpened to wound without blood. Isabelle didn't flinch. She didn't have to. The flash drive, the footage, the bruises, the testimony all waited in line behind her. Her armor wasn't metal. It was truth. When it was Isabelle's turn to testify, the room held its breath. The clerk swore her in. She placed her hand on the Bible, but it was Koda's eyes in the gallery's still, steady, dark pools of silent encouragement that grounded her. She sat, and for the first time, she didn't tremble. "My name is Isabelle Ree," she began, "and I'm not here because I'm perfect. I'm here because I survived." No flourish, no drama, just fact. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried like a river that had learned how to cut through stone. She spoke of the first lie, the first bruise. The first night she locked herself in the bathroom with Benjamin, heart pounding as Robert pounded harder on the door. She spoke of the day she realized no one was coming. Then she spoke of the dog, how he didn't hesitate. How Koda saw through every layer she'd buried herself under. How he barked not at her, but for her truth, for her son. Across the room, Robert's jaw tightened. Still, he wouldn't meet her eyes. Isabelle finally turned toward him. "I brought the gun," she admitted. "I didn't want to. I never planned to use it. But when you've been erased for long enough, you carry something that proves you exist." The judge's pen paused mid-scribble. Silence fell again, but this time, it didn't feel like cold distance. It felt like gravity, the kind that pulls truth into light. As court recessed, reporters hovered outside. Cameras flashed like lightning, but Isabelle didn't look away. She stepped outside with her head high and Koda at her side. Not to perform, but to walk through the storm she once ran from. And this time her steps didn't echo alone. The lights dimmed just slightly, the projector screen flickering to life with a faint hum. Isabelle's face remained still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't look away. The prosecutor nodded toward the technician in the corner. "Play Exhibit 17. A soft beep. Then the screen came alive with the dull gray footage of a home security camera angled from a corner of the living room. At first, just mundane sounds, a microwave hum, a child's faint gurgle. Then his voice, Robert's voice, razor sharp, low and cold. "You can't even hold a baby right. God, what do you do all day?" The audience in the gallery didn't breathe. On screen, Isabelle flinched at the words, stepping back as she held her infant. He followed. The clip ended just as his hand raised, cut to black. Then another, and another. Slaps, shouts, her body curling inward, always shielding the baby. His accusations growing louder, more vulgar, more unhinged. Each clip carved deeper than the last. The walls of the courtroom seemed to contract inward with every second. The judge shifted. She didn't speak. Her mouth tightened, her fingers folded, but her eyes, once detached and impartial, now burned with quiet fury. The last video rolled, a whisper-captured audio recording. "I'll make sure no one believes a word you say," Robert hissed. "You'll be in a hospital bed, and I'll have our son. You'll be nothing." The sound cut, and then the real silence came. Not awkward, not empty, but weighted. The kind of silence that arrives when truth doesn't need commentary. Isabelle didn't cry. Neither did Nora. Neither did Koda, who sat like a sentinel in the back of the courtroom, unmoving, except for the slight rise and fall of his breath. The judge leaned forward. Her voice, when it returned, was hoarse but resolute. "This is no longer a custody dispute." She paused, looked directly at Robert. "This is a criminal trial." Gasps rippled through the room. But Robert, once unshakable, finally blinked. His hands, folded confidently all morning, now tightened into fists beneath the table. Isabelle closed her eyes, not in fear, but in release. For years she'd lived in a world where her reality was denied, reshaped, and silenced. But now the truth had a volume louder than any scream. Now it echoed in a courtroom, and for the first time it was heard. The courtroom was still, as if the building itself held its breath. Judge Ramirez flipped through the final pages of her notes, her expression unreadable. The gavel sat untouched. The seal of the court gleamed behind her. But today, justice wasn't an emblem. It was a woman at the bench watching another woman who had once been told she was worthless stand tall and unbroken. "I've reviewed the testimony," the judge began, voice steady, slow. "The documentation, the footage, the psychological evaluations." Her eyes briefly met Isabelle's, then flicked toward the defense table. "And I've seen the face behind the mask, Mr. Song." Robert didn't move. Not a twitch. His tie was still straight, his posture perfect. But the veneer had cracked. His knuckles were pale where they gripped the edge of the table. "In regard to the matter of custody," the judge continued, "this court hereby grants permanent sole custody of Benjamin Seong to his mother, Isabelle Rhee." A soft sound escaped Isabelle's lips. Not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, just a breath. But it was the kind of breath one takes when chains fall away. The judge turned a page. "In regard to the defendant, Robert Seong, formal criminal charges will be filed immediately, including, but not limited to, aggravated domestic assault, child endangerment, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice." From the gallery, murmurs swelled, reporters scribbling furiously, observers exchanging stunned glances. Even Robert's lawyer sat back, eyes wide, as if he'd realized too late that the game was over. "And finally," Judge Ramirez said, looking down at the final sheet of paper, "the court hereby dismisses all charges against Ms. Rhee related to her entry into the United States, the possession of a firearm, and the incident at the airport terminal under the ruling of emergency self-defense and protective necessity." Silence fell again. And then, thump. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it came from the back of the courtroom. Koda, sitting beside Nora, had wagged his tail. Just once. As if to say, "I knew it all along." Isabelle didn't cry. Not because she wasn't moved, but because her body, after so many years of fear, had finally chosen something else. Stillness. She looked toward the back of the room. Nora gave a small nod. Koda tilted his head and blinked slowly, like an old soldier acknowledging another's survival. And for the first time in her life, Isabelle Rhee was no longer a victim. She was the verdict. The sentence that echoed wasn't punishment, it was freedom. The envelope was unmarked, save for a name printed in soft blue ink. Nora. It arrived on a gray Thursday morning, tucked inside the mail slot at the airport K9 unit's office. No return address, no postage, just slipped through the gap like something meant only for her. Nora found it as she was finishing paperwork, her coffee cold beside her. She turned it over once in her hand, then slid her thumb beneath the flap and opened it slowly. Inside was a single folded sheet and a crayon drawing, slightly wrinkled, edges soft. The letter came first. "You didn't just do your job, you saw me. You didn't ask me to prove pain. You believed it before I could name it. Most people look at women like me and wonder what we did wrong. You looked at me and saw what was done to me." Koda didn't bark to accuse. He barked to protect. He reminded me of something I forgot existed, the instinct to be loved, without having to beg for it. That day, I walked into an airport thinking I'd be arrested or killed. And somehow, I walked out with dignity, a future, and a friend I didn't expect. "I want you to have this. Benjamin drew it yesterday." Nora unfolded the second page. Crayon lines, wild and imperfect, filled the space, the colors bold, like a child learning to name his world for the first time. In the center, a woman with short brown hair, a tall dog with pointed ears, and a small boy with a round face, all three smiling. The sun above them had a crooked grin. The dog was drawn bigger than the others, almost protectively so. In shaky toddler handwriting, a word stretched above them all: family. No I, no need. Nora stared at it for a long moment. Then gently, she folded the letter again, not like an officer logging evidence, but like someone tucking away something sacred. She placed it in the top drawer of her locker, behind an old medal and next to a photo from her first deployment. Koda, resting at her feet, let out a low, content huff. He hadn't even opened his eyes, as if he knew. Some gestures don't need commands. Some gratitude doesn't need applause. Sometimes the truest thank you fits in a child's drawing. The call came on a rainy afternoon. Nora was drying Koda's fur with an old towel, his coat still damp from their patrol shift, when her desk phone buzzed, a soft ring barely louder than the drizzle against the windows. She glanced at the screen. "Clara Eves, Sentinel Outreach Network." No badge number, civilian line. "Vance," she answered, still kneeling beside Koda. The voice on the other end was warm, steady. "Officer Vance, I'm sorry to call out of the blue. My name is Clara. I'm with a nonprofit called Sentinel Outreach. We specialize in placing trained canines with survivors of domestic violence and trauma. I read about what happened at SeaTac, about Koda." Nora tensed slightly. The media hadn't named her, but the story had spread. "Customs canine prevents tragedy. Infant safe. Mother held. Investigation ongoing." But Clara's tone wasn't probing. It was reverent. "We don't usually reach out this way," she continued. "But your dog, what he did, how he did it, that's instinct. That's beyond training. It's the kind of trust we try to teach, but can't always find." Nora looked down at Koda. He'd settled beside her, chin resting on her boot, as if to say, "Don't worry, I know who to trust." Clara went on. "We'd like to feature Koda's story anonymously, if you prefer, as part of our new outreach campaign, to show what survivor-trained dogs can do. Not just in protection, but in recognizing what even trained eyes can miss." There was a pause on the line. "We want people to know that sometimes the ones labeled too difficult are the ones who end up saving lives." Nora felt something catch in her throat. Koda, the dog they almost wrote off, the one no handler could fix, the one who refused orders if they didn't come from the right place. She cleared her voice gently. "He's not trained to be gentle. He chose to be." Clara softened. "That's what we want to share." A week later, a photo appeared on Sentinel's website. Koda, sitting tall beside Nora's shadow, not facing the camera but slightly turned his gaze off frame, like he saw something the rest of the world had missed. The caption read, "This is Koda. He didn't bark to accuse, he barked to protect. When no one believed her, he did." The story went viral within hours. Messages flooded in, survivors who had fled silently, counselors looking for hope, even officers who confessed that sometimes their dogs had warned them, but they hadn't listened. Koda became more than a hero. He became a symbol of instinct over assumption, of second chances, of believing before the world demands proof. Back at the station, Koda didn't seem to notice the fame. He still lay by Nora's desk, still scanned the terminal with quiet precision, still nudged officers who were having bad days. But once, just once, when a junior recruit asked Nora what made Koda different, she didn't speak. She just looked down at him, smiled, and said, "Some dogs follow commands. Koda follows his heart. And sometimes that's the only command that matters." The garden was small, just a few raised beds, bordered by worn bricks that someone else had probably laid long ago. But to Isabelle, it was a beginning. Her hands were covered in soil, fingertips dark with earth that smelled like rain and hope. Beside her, a tray of seedlings waited: basil, cherry tomatoes, lavender. She moved slowly, carefully, as if each plant were a promise she wasn't quite ready to break. A breeze moved through the fence slats, carrying the scent of lemon balm and damp cedar. The house behind her was modest, rented, creaky, not quite new, but it was hers. Not because she owned it, but because no one could take it away from her this time. Benjamin's laughter rang out from the yard. He was chasing bubbles, fat, shimmering orbs that caught the sunlight like floating stained glass. Koda padded nearby, never too far from the toddler's side, his gaze sweeping the yard like a silent sentinel. Isabelle looked up and watched the scene for a long moment. She remembered the sterile walls of the airport, the fear in her chest that night, the weight of the Glock hidden under the blanket, the feeling of drowning while trying to run. But that was a different life, a different Isabelle. This one had dirt under her nails and a spine that didn't curve inward anymore. This one had survived. She pressed the last seedling into the earth and sat back, brushing the sweat from her brow. Benjamin came running up with a bubble wand in one hand and a twig in the other. "Koda chased it!" he squealed, pointing at a bubble now dissolving mid-air. "But it popped!" Koda wagged once, then flopped onto the warm grass like a seasoned veteran who'd earned his nap. Isabelle smiled, not the forced kind she'd used to offer to strangers, but a real, grounded kind. The kind that came from peace, not performance. Benjamin plopped beside her, leaning against her leg. She looked at the garden, the yard, the faint echo of laughter still in the air. Then, softly, not whispered, not rushed, she said, "We're home." And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she meant it. There were no news crews, no courtrooms, no more mirrors she had to practice bravery in front of. There was just this: the smell of earth, the hum of summer, a child's joy, and a dog who never needed words to understand the weight someone carried. Isabelle didn't need everything to be perfect. She just needed to breathe without asking permission. And in this quiet patch of soil and sky, she finally could. The gate creaked open just as the sunlight broke through the trees, dappling the yard with fractured gold. Birds chirped in the high branches like they knew something good was about to happen. Koda stepped in first, slow, deliberate, tail high with memory. Behind him, Nora Vance stood with a coffee thermos in one hand and that rare softness on her face that only Koda ever seemed to bring out. She didn't have to knock. The moment the latch clicked, Benjamin's voice rang out like thunder on a quiet lake. "Koda!" From the far end of the yard, the toddler tore across the grass, arms out, giggling in that way children do when they're not just excited, they're safe. Koda met him halfway, lowering his head like a knight greeting royalty. Benjamin flung his arms around the dog's neck, his laughter bubbling with a familiarity that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with trust. Isabelle stepped onto the porch. Her hair was pinned up, apron still dusted with flour, sleeves rolled past her elbows. She looked grounded, not weighed down by the past, but not untouched by it either. She called out, "You're early." Nora raised the thermos. "Blame the dog. He started pacing before sunrise." Koda, as if in response, gave a single bark, short, sharp, then turned back to Benjamin, who was now showing him a stick he'd clearly decided was valuable enough to keep. Isabelle descended the porch steps, the morning light catching the outline of her face. There was no tremble in her hands now, no darting eyes. The woman who had once curled into corners was gone. This woman had roots. Nora met her at the bottom of the steps. "You look," she began. Isabelle finished it. "Like I belong here?" Nora smiled. "Exactly like that." They stood for a moment, watching Benjamin now trying to convince Koda to sit inside a cardboard rocket ship drawn with crayons. "How's therapy?" Nora asked. "Hard," Isabelle replied, "but honest." She took a deep breath, one that didn't hitch halfway through. "For the first time, I don't feel like I'm surviving anymore. I'm just living." Nora looked over at Benjamin, who was now laughing uncontrollably, as Koda awkwardly but willingly stepped one paw into the cardboard box, then sat completely still, his idea of cooperation. "You trained him well?" Isabelle said. "No," Nora replied, her voice low. "He trained me." Their eyes met, not in pity, not even in gratitude, but in a quiet recognition of the roads they'd walked. Different, but lined with the same kind of shadows. And now, the same kind of light. Isabelle reached out, resting a hand on Koda's back. "You still keeping us safe?" Koda didn't move, but his tail thumped once. Nora watched them, the woman who had fled with a gun and a baby, now standing tall in her own yard, and the boy who had once cried without understanding why, now giggling beside a dog who had never needed words to understand anything. "Some mornings," Nora said, mostly to herself, "you wake up and realize the world didn't end. It just began again." Isabelle nodded slowly. "This is one of those mornings." And as Koda lay down next to Benjamin, head up, ears twitching at every rustle in the wind, Nora thought, maybe that's what Koda always knew. Not just danger, but the moments worth returning for. They sat at the old wooden table just inside the kitchen. The kind of table where meals weren't just eaten but shared, stories told, silences accepted. The afternoon light filtered through gingham curtains, soft and golden, dust motes dancing like memories caught in midair. Nora placed the sealed manila folder on the table. Isabelle stared at it, hesitant. Her fingers were still coated in flour from the pie crust she'd been preparing with Benjamin. A small handprint was pressed into the fabric of her jeans, a reminder of how far she'd come from padded rooms and interrogation mirrors. "It's yours," Nora said gently, nudging it forward, "straight from the Justice Department." Isabelle didn't reach for it right away. Her eyes flicked to the name typed on the front. Isabelle Ree. Clearance. No record. Status. Protected. No aliases. No asterisks. No shadows. Just her. She blinked once, then again, slower. I thought this part would never come. I know, Nora said. So did I. Koda sat at her side, ever still, watching, waiting. Isabelle finally opened the folder. Inside it was more than paperwork. It was proof. Pages signed and sealed, stamped clearances, documentation of her testimony, of the evidence of the charges pressed against Robert Seong, now awaiting sentencing, custody rulings, name restoration. She flipped to the last page. The final sentence was simple. Case closed. Her shoulders fell, not in defeat, but in the kind of release that only comes when the weight of fear finally lifts after years of being strapped too tight. She didn't cry like she thought she would. The tears didn't come in sobs or gasps, just a single stunned breath, and then the wet shimmer of her lashes. Koda moved first. He rose and nudged his muzzle under her hand, not urgently, not dramatically, just enough to be felt, as if to say, "Told you so." Isabelle laughed, broken and bright all at once. You really don't let things go, do you? Koda blinked slowly. His tail gave one slow sweep across the floor. Nora watched, heart caught in that quiet space between closure and something deeper. Belonging. There had been no medal ceremony, no flashing cameras, just a battered folder and a dog who never needed words to speak truth. You can travel now, Nora said. Rebuild, start fresh, or stay. That's your call. Isabelle shook her head. I don't need to run anymore. She looked up, voice steadier now. I'm already where I need to be. Footsteps patted down the hall. Benjamin, dragging a toy fire truck, chocolate smeared across one cheek. He climbed into Isabelle's lap without asking, resting his head against her shoulder. His other hand reached down and settled on Koda's ear, stroking it lazily. Nora smiled. He knows. They both do, Isabelle whispered. A breeze moved through the open window, fluttering the corner of the folder. A signature page lifted slightly, enough for a shaft of sunlight to catch it, glowing gold. Outside, birds still sang. Inside, peace settled like dust in warm corners. And Koda? He lay down again, but not in full rest. His eyes stayed open, his body relaxed, yet still ready. As if he understood what few others could. The war might be over. But his watch was not. The gravel crunched softly beneath their feet as Nora and Koda approached the front gate. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard, but none of them felt heavy. In fact, everything about the moment felt strangely weightless, like exhaling after holding your breath too long. Isabelle stood beside them. Benjamin perched on her hip, his thumb still in his mouth, his eyes drooping in that soft, contented way toddlers do when they feel safe. Nora adjusted Koda's vest out of habit, though today there was no mission. Just a visit, just the end of something and the quiet beginning of something else. The silence lingered, warm this time. Not the kind that used to haunt Isabelle's nights. This silence felt earned, like a closing curtain after the final bow. As Nora opened the gate, Koda hesitated, just for a moment, and that was when Isabelle stepped forward. She reached down, her hand brushing through the thick fur at his neck. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with reverence. She leaned in close, her voice barely more than breath against his ear. Thank you for disobeying." Koda turned his head, not fully, not dramatically, just a subtle tilt, just enough for their eyes to meet, just enough to say, "I heard you, and maybe I'd do it again." Nora caught the moment but said nothing. Some things didn't need explaining. Some truths didn't need words. They walked back to the car. Benjamin waved sleepily over Isabelle's shoulder. Koda's tail swayed once, gently, as if sealing something unspoken. And in the fading light, as the gate clicked shut behind them, one truth remained. Sometimes it's the one who refuses to follow the rules, who breaks the silence, who sees what others ignore, that ends up saving everything. And for that, no command was ever needed. Just instinct, just heart, just a dog who understood. In a world often too quick to judge and too slow to listen, it was a German shepherd named Koda who reminded us of something simple and powerful. Trust your instinct, especially when it's wrapped in silence and fur. This story isn't just about a woman escaping abuse or a child growing up safe. It's about second chances, about the quiet strength it takes to survive when no one believes you, and the even greater courage it takes to trust again. Koda, once deemed unfit, became a symbol of what happens when we stop labeling and start listening, when we look beyond behavior and ask why. When we remember that some of the truest heroes walk on four legs, see with their hearts, and love without question. German shepherds like Koda remind us that loyalty isn't taught, it's lived. That the deepest kind of protection doesn't need a command, only a cause, and that sometimes the bravest thing anyone or any dog can do is break the silence. May this story spark deeper compassion for animals, greater awareness for survivors, and a lasting belief that healing begins with those who choose to see.